Victorian London, 1868. A man floats out of a third-story window, levitates horizontally through the air, and floats back in through another window, all while three credible witnesses watch in stunned silence. One of those witnesses is a master of Trinity College, Cambridge. Another is a cousin of a future prime minister. They swear, until their dying days, that it happened exactly as described. His name was Daniel Dunglas Hume, and he was the most investigated medium of the 19th century. Scientists tested him. Skeptics pursued him. Magicians tried to expose him. Royalty paid fortunes to witness his seances. And here's the remarkable part. In a career spanning over 25 years, performing thousands of seances for some of the sharpest minds in Europe, Daniel Dunglas Hume was never caught in fraud. Not once. Was he the real deal? The greatest magician who ever lived? Or something else entirely? Today, we're diving into the true story of the Victorian sorcerer that science could not discredit. Daniel Dunglas Hume was born on March 20, 1833, near Edinburgh, Scotland. But his story doesn't begin in the misty Highlands. It begins with abandonment and illness. Hume's early childhood was marked by tragedy. His father, William Hume, was reportedly an illegitimate son of the 10th Earl of Hume, giving Daniel a tenuous connection to Scottish aristocracy, a connection he would later emphasize. His mother, Elizabeth MacNeill, was the daughter of a Highland seer, a woman said to possess second sight, the Celtic ability to perceive future events and communicate with spirits. When Daniel was just 1 year old, he was adopted by his mother's sister, Mary Cook, who was childless and wanted to raise him as her own. The Cook family emigrated when Daniel was 9 years old, settling in Connecticut and later moving to Troy, New York. From earliest childhood, Hume was different. He was severely tubercular, what Victorians called consumption, a disease that gave him a ghostly, ethereal appearance. He was painfully thin, pale, with an almost translucent quality to his skin. He coughed blood. Doctors repeatedly told him he wouldn't live to adulthood. But the tuberculosis wasn't the only thing that set him apart. Hume claimed that strange things happened around him. Objects moved without being touched. Rappings and knocking sounds followed him. He said he saw the spirits of dead relatives and could predict future events. At age 4, he reportedly had a vision of a childhood friend's death and learned the next day that the boy had died at the exact moment of his vision. His Aunt Mary was a strict Presbyterian who viewed these phenomena with horror. To her, this wasn't a gift, it was demonic. She tried prayer, discipline, and eventually, when Daniel was 17, she threw him out of the house. His strange abilities terrified her. Alone, sickly, and essentially homeless, Daniel Dunglas Hume was forced to rely on the one thing that made him unique, his supposed ability to communicate with the dead. It was 1850, and he had perfect timing. To understand Hume's success, you need to understand the context he emerged into. In 1848, just a few years before Hume began his career, 2 young sisters in Hydesville, New York, Kate and Margaret Fox, claimed to have made contact with the spirit through mysterious rapping sounds. Their Rochester rappings became a sensation, and spiritualism was born as a religious movement. By the early 1850s, spiritualism was sweeping across America and Britain like wildfire. Why? Several factors converged perfectly. First, the mid-19th century was a time of devastating mortality. Child mortality rates were astronomical. Tuberculosis, cholera, and other diseases killed young people regularly. Almost every family had lost someone, often multiple people, to sudden death. The grief was universal and profound. Second, traditional Christianity's rigid doctrines about heaven, hell, and damnation offered little comfort to many. Spiritualism offered something more appealing. The dead weren't gone forever. They were just on the other side, and you could still communicate with them. Third, this was the age of scientific revolution. Electricity, telegraphy, photography, and other technologies were revealing invisible forces that seemed almost magical. If invisible electricity could send messages across continents, why couldn't invisible spiritual forces allow communication with the dead? Finally, spiritualism appealed to progressive movements. Many spiritualists were abolitionists, women's rights activists, and social reformers. The movement suggested that spiritual authority came from individual experience, not religious hierarchy, a revolutionary idea. Into this perfect storm stepped Daniel Dunglas Hume, and he was unlike any medium anyone had seen before. Most mediums of the era operated in similar ways. They held seances in darkened rooms. They went into trances and delivered messages in changed voices. They produced spirit rappings by secretly cracking their toe joints or using hidden accomplices. They required specific conditions: darkness, hand-holding, magnetic circles that made investigation difficult. Daniel Dunglas Hume was different. First, he never charged money. Never. In an era when mediums were increasingly viewed as charlatans bilking the bereaved, Hume accepted only hospitality and gifts. He would stay as a house guest of wealthy patrons, perform seances, and accept whatever donations they offered. This made accusations of fraud more difficult. What was his motive if not money? Second, Hume performed in full light or bright gaslight, not darkness. He allowed investigation before seances. People could examine the room, check for hidden apparatus, and satisfy themselves that no trickery was prepared. Third, the phenomena reported at Hume's seances were spectacular and varied. Table levitations. Heavy tables would rise completely off the floor, floating in midair while multiple witnesses touched it. Sometimes the table would tilt at impossible angles without falling. Rappings and knockings. Loud, clear knocking sounds would emanate from walls, floors, and furniture in response to questions. These weren't subtle. They were thunderous bangs that shook rooms. Phantom hands. Witnesses reported seeing and feeling ghostly hands, solid enough to shake hands with, yet clearly not belonging to any living person in the room. These hands would touch faces, write messages, and manipulate objects. Musical instruments playing. Accordions would play melodies while floating through the air, with no one touching them. Hand bells would ring and fly around the room. Levitation. Hume himself would rise into the air, floating horizontally several feet above the ground. Witnesses could pass their hands beneath him, confirming he wasn't standing on anything. Elongation. Hume claimed he could extend his height by several inches and demonstrate this while standing against a marked wall. Fire immunity. Perhaps his most spectacular demonstration, Hume would handle burning coals with his bare hands, hold them without injury, and even place them on the heads of witnesses without burning them. But the most famous incident, the one that cemented Hume's legend, was the Adair levitation of 1868. December 16, 1868. Ashley House, London. 3 witnesses, Lord Adair, the Master of Lindsay, and Captain Charles Wynne. According to their testimony, which they maintained consistently for the rest of their lives and documented in detailed written accounts, this is what happened. During a seance, Hume went into a trance. He left the room and entered an adjacent bedroom. The witnesses heard the window open. Then Hume appeared to re-enter the seance room through a different window. Lord Adair's account describes Hume floating out of one third-story window, levitating horizontally across the exterior of the building some 70 feet above the street, and floating back in through another window, all while in a trance state. The Master of Lindsay wrote, "I saw Hume's feet about 6 inches above the window sill. He stood upright for a minute, then drifted out of the open window. When it was over, Hume had no memory of the event. The witnesses were shaken, but adamant about what they'd seen. Skeptics have attacked this story from every angle. They suggest the witnesses were drunk. No evidence of this. That it was dark. It wasn't. There was moonlight and gaslight. That the windows were closer together than described. Architectural analysis confirms the distance, or that it simply didn't happen, and the witnesses conspired to lie. But why? For what gain? Some researchers have suggested Hume might have crawled along a ledge, but witnesses insisted they saw him floating horizontally, not climbing. Others suggest mass hallucination or hypnosis, but these three men were educated, sober, and had no history of delusion. The Ashley House levitation remains one of the most controversial events in paranormal history. But here's the thing. It wasn't isolated. Hume performed hundreds of seances, and levitation was a regular feature. By the 1860s, Hume's fame had spread across Europe. He performed for Napoleon III and Empress Eugenie in France, for Tsar Alexander II in Russia, and for countless members of European aristocracy. But he also attracted serious scientific attention. The most important investigation came from Sir William Crookes, one of Victorian Britain's most respected scientists. Crookes had discovered the element thallium, pioneered work in spectroscopy, and would later be knighted and awarded the Order of Merit. He was no fool, and he was initially skeptical of spiritualism. In 1870, Crookes decided to investigate Hume scientifically. He wrote, "The increased employment of scientific methods will promote exact observation and greater love of truth among inquirers, and will produce a race of observers who will drive the worthless residuum of spiritualism hence into the unknown limbo of magic and necromancy." In other words, Crookes expected to expose Hume as a fraud using scientific rigor. What happened shocked him. Crookes designed a series of experiments to test Hume's abilities under controlled conditions. The most famous involved an accordion sealed in a cage. The cage was wire mesh, designed so that Hume could touch it, but couldn't physically reach inside to manipulate the instrument. The cage was placed under a table, in full view of multiple witnesses. Hume placed his hand on top of the cage, outside it, where everyone could see. The accordion, inside the sealed cage, began to play. It played recognizable melodies. It moved up and down inside the cage, all while Hume's hands remained visible outside the cage, and multiple witnesses confirmed he couldn't possibly be manipulating it through normal means. Crookes also conducted experiments with scales and measuring devices, testing whether Hume could influence physical objects at a distance. He reported positive results. Objects moved, scales registered weight changes, all under conditions that seemed to rule out conventional trickery. In 1874, after years of investigation, Crookes published his findings. He confirmed that he had witnessed genuine phenomena that couldn't be explained by known scientific principles or by fraud. He wrote, "I have tested Hume in every way that I could devise. The result has been to convince me thoroughly that there are certain phenomena which cannot be explained by any recognized physical laws." The scientific establishment was not pleased. Crookes faced significant criticism and mockery from his peers. Some suggested he had been duped. Others implied he was senile or losing his scientific credibility. But Crookes never backed down from his conclusions about Hume. Other scientists investigated Hume with similar results. Robert Hare, an emeritus professor of chemistry at the University of Pennsylvania, initially set out to expose spiritualism as fraud. After investigating Hume, he converted to belief in genuine phenomena. The same happened with William Crookes's colleague, the physicist William Barrett. Lord Rayleigh, who would win the Nobel Prize in Physics, attended Hume's seances and came away puzzled, unable to explain what he'd witnessed by conventional means. The list of credible witnesses goes on. The poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, though her husband Robert Browning detested Hume. The novelist Leo Tolstoy, the scientist Alfred Russel Wallace, co-discoverer of natural selection with Darwin, and countless aristocrats and educated observers. Here's what's crucial. While many spiritualist mediums were exposed as frauds during this era, and fraud was absolutely rampant, Hume was never caught using trickery. Professional magicians attended his seances hoping to detect his methods, and came away baffled. But not everyone was convinced, and Hume had enemies. Robert Browning, husband of poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, despised Hume. After attending a seance, Browning became convinced Hume was a charlatan preying on the bereaved. He wrote a scathing poem called Mr. Sludge, the Medium, clearly based on Hume, depicting a fraudulent medium who confesses to trickery. Browning's wife Elizabeth disagreed with her husband and believed Hume was genuine, causing friction in their marriage. This split reaction was common. Witnesses at the same seance would come to completely different conclusions. The most serious controversy came in 1868, when Hume became involved with an elderly widow named Jane Lyon. Mrs. Lyon was wealthy and became obsessed with Hume, believing he could connect her with her dead husband. She adopted Hume as her son and gave him substantial sums of money, totaling around £60,000, an enormous fortune. Then Mrs. Lyon changed her mind. She claimed Hume had used undue influence to extract money from her and sued him to get it back. The case went to court in 1868, and it was sensational. The trial revealed unflattering details about Hume's relationships with wealthy patrons. The judge ruled in Mrs. Lyon's favor, ordering Hume to return the money. The judge's comments were scathing, calling Hume an impostor and suggesting he deliberately manipulated vulnerable people. Hume's defenders argued that Mrs. Lyon was mentally unstable and had pursued him, not the other way around. They pointed out that he had accepted gifts freely offered, not extracted them through deception. But the damage to his reputation was significant. The trial raised important questions. Even if Hume's phenomena were genuine, was it ethical to accept enormous sums from bereaved and emotionally vulnerable people? Where's the line between accepting gifts and exploitation? Throughout his career, Hume also faced criticism from other mediums and spiritualists. Some claimed he was too friendly with scientists and skeptics, too willing to submit to investigation. Others suggested his phenomena were too spectacular, too theatrical, compared to the quiet, message-focused seances other mediums conducted. And some skeptics simply refused to accept any evidence. They argued that no matter how credible the witnesses or how controlled the conditions, fraud must be the explanation, because the alternative, genuine paranormal phenomena was impossible. This raises a fascinating philosophical question. What kind of evidence would convince a determined skeptic? If a phenomenon only happens occasionally, under specific conditions, with certain individuals present, how do you prove it scientifically? And if the phenomena violate known laws of physics, is it more rational to question the observations, or to question whether we understand all the laws of nature? By the 1870s, Hume's career was winding down. His tuberculosis, which had plagued him since childhood, was getting worse. The disease that had given him his ethereal, ghostly appearance was finally catching up with him. His powers also seemed to be fading. Seances became less dramatic, the phenomena less spectacular. Hume himself acknowledged this, suggesting that the spiritual forces he channeled were weakening or that his own declining health interfered with his abilities. In 1871, Hume married for a second time. His first wife had died in 1862. His second wife, Julie de Glumline, was a wealthy Russian woman, and they settled into a quieter life. Hume wrote his autobiography, Incidents in My Life, defending his career and documenting his experiences. He traveled less, performed fewer seances, and spent more time with his family. The boy who had been cast out by his aunt, who had been told repeatedly he would die young, had somehow survived into his 40s, far longer than anyone expected. But tuberculosis is patient, and it always wins. On June 21, 1886, Daniel Dunglas Hume died in France at the age of 53. He was buried in a cemetery near Paris, France. His death was quiet, conventional, and remarkably normal for a man whose life had been anything but. There were no dramatic supernatural occurrences, no messages from beyond, no vindication or final proof of his abilities. He simply died, as all people do, regardless of whether they can levitate. So what do we make of Daniel Dunglas Hume? More than 135 years after his death, he remains one of the most puzzling figures in the history of paranormal investigation. Let's consider the possibilities. Theory 1. He was genuine. This requires accepting that paranormal phenomena are real, that some individuals can produce effects that violate our understanding of physics, and that consciousness or spiritual forces can interact with physical matter in ways science doesn't recognize. The evidence for this: thousands of witnessed seances, investigations by credible scientists, the variety and consistency of phenomena, the fact he was never caught in fraud, and the changed lives of skeptical witnesses who became believers. The problems with this: it requires overturning fundamental principles of physics. It doesn't explain why these phenomena are so unreliable and can't be consistently reproduced, and it raises the question of why. If these abilities are real, they don't demonstrate more clearly or beneficially. Theory 2. He was a magician using techniques unknown to his contemporaries. This suggests Hume was extraordinarily skilled at sleight of hand, misdirection, and illusion, so skilled that he could fool careful observers, professional magicians, and scientists in well-lit conditions while being physically investigated. The evidence for this: we know magic can fool people. We know Victorian scientists weren't trained in detecting deception. We know that suggestion and expectation can influence perception. And we know that even smart people can be fooled. The problems with this: professional magicians who attended Hume's seances couldn't figure out his methods. He allowed investigation under conditions that should have revealed apparatus. His phenomena were too varied and spontaneous for prearranged tricks. And no one has successfully replicated his full range of effects using magic methods. Theory 3. Some combination, perhaps unconscious psychokinesis mixed with occasional trickery. This suggests Hume might have had some genuine unusual ability, perhaps unconscious psychokinetic effects, triggered by his epilepsy or tuberculosis-induced altered states, combined with showmanship and occasional enhancement when the real phenomena weren't performing. This might explain the variability of effects, the fact that phenomena seem tied to Hume's physical and emotional states, and why investigation produced ambiguous results. Theory 4. Mass hallucination, suggestion, or altered states. This suggests Hume was extraordinarily charismatic and could induce altered states of consciousness in witnesses, making them perceive events that didn't physically happen or remember events differently than they occurred. The problems: multiple witnesses with no prior connection independently confirmed the same events. Physical trace evidence sometimes remained, moved objects, accordion music. And this doesn't explain the results of Crookes's scientific apparatus tests. Here's what we can say with confidence. Daniel Dunglas Hume performed thousands of seances over 25 years and was never definitively exposed as a fraud. Multiple credible witnesses, including scientists and skeptics, reported witnessing phenomena they couldn't explain. Hume operated under conditions that should have made conventional magic difficult or impossible. Many people who attended his seances left convinced they'd witnessed genuine paranormal phenomena. The scientific establishment largely rejected the findings of investigators like Crookes, regardless of the evidence. Hume's career and the investigations of him reveal as much about Victorian society, science, and belief as they do about Hume himself The story of Daniel Dunglas Hume is ultimately a story about evidence, belief, and the limits of what we think is possible. In an era when most mediums were exposed as frauds, using hidden accomplices, trick apparatus, and outright deception, Hume stands apart. Whether he was genuine, an unparalleled magician, or something in between, he achieved something remarkable. He made serious scientists question their assumptions about reality. The Victorian era was obsessed with drawing boundaries between science and superstition, the natural and supernatural, the credible and incredible. Hume existed in the liminal space between these categories, never quite fitting into any of them. Maybe that's why his story remains fascinating. Not because we can definitively prove what he did or how he did it, but because his case challenges us to think about the nature of evidence itself. When do we trust eyewitness testimony? How much evidence is enough? At what point does skepticism become closed-mindedness? When is it rational to accept something that seems impossible? These questions are as relevant today as they were in the 1870s. We still argue about the nature of consciousness, the possibility of phenomena beyond current scientific understanding, and how to balance open-minded inquiry with critical thinking. Daniel Dunglas Hume, the sickly child cast out by his family, the medium who never charged for his services, the man who floated out of windows and handled burning coals, left behind not answers, but better questions. And perhaps that's the most supernatural thing about him. More than a century after his death, he's still making us wonder. What do you think? Was Daniel Dunglas Hume the real deal? The greatest magician who ever lived, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about your theories. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most puzzling figures, hit that subscribe button. We're exploring more strange historical mysteries, where the evidence doesn't fit neatly into any category. Thanks for watching, and remember, the most interesting stories are the ones that don't have easy answers.